Hello and welcome to tonight's journey with me. Tonight we will not follow an ordinary life. We will follow the story of a man who reshaped the known world, Alexander of Macedon, remembered as Alexander the Great. At just 20 years old, he inherited a fragile throne. Within 12 years, he carved an empire stretching from Greece to India, a feat unmatched in history. But behind glory stood blood, betrayal, and questions that still divide historians. If you find this story fascinating, stay with me, because the truths we uncover are rarely written in school books. Tell me, where are you listening from, and what time is it right now? In a few moments, your screen will begin to fade into darkness. This is not an error. It is meant to rest your eyes, to help your body produce melatonin, the hormone of sleep, and to let you listen in peace. A little darkness tells your brain it's time to rest. And now, we begin. In the rugged valleys of Greece, mountains shaped politics as much as philosophy. By 500 BC, city-states flourished, each pursuing its own vision of power. Athens, with its navy, became a beacon of democracy, theatre, and philosophy. Sparta, in contrast, perfected military austerity, raising boys to fight and die for the state. These two rivals would define the fate of the Greek world for centuries. In 480 BC, their combined armies faced the greatest superpower of the age, Persia. At Thermopylae, 300 Spartans held the pass for 3 days, a legend of sacrifice still retold. Soon after, at Salamis, the Athenian fleet crushed the Persian navy, showing how tactics could defeat numbers. 1 year later, at Plataea, the Greeks won decisively, forcing Persia to retreat. These victories secured Greek independence, but the scars ran deep. Temples on the Acropolis still bore burn marks from Persian fires. The next half-century became Athens' golden age. Sculptors carved marble statues of gods and heroes, while dramatists filled theatres with tragedies that spoke of fate and pride. Philosophers like Socrates challenged citizens to examine their lives, and Pericles oversaw the construction of the Parthenon. Yet prosperity fed rivalry. By 431 BC, Athens and Sparta clashed in the Peloponnesian War, dragging allies into decades of bloodshed. Grain prices soared, plague devastated Athens, and battlefields across Greece filled with the dead. The war ended in 404 BC, with Sparta victorious, but neither side emerged strong. For nearly a century, wars between city-states continued. The Greek world, once united against Persia, now fractured into bitter rivals. In this exhaustion lay opportunity for a northern kingdom, once dismissed as barbarian Macedonia. Greeks long considered Macedonia a backwater. Its rugged terrain bred hardy warriors, but little culture in the eyes of Athenians. Yet under King Philip II, who reigned from 359 BC, Macedonia transformed. Philip reformed the army, introducing the sarissa, an 18-foot pike. Twice the length of a normal spear, it demanded discipline. Soldiers trained to fight in deep phalanx formations, 16 ranks thick, a bristling wall of iron tips. This was not the rabble Athens imagined, but a professional force drilled with ruthless precision. Philip combined military innovation with cunning diplomacy. He married into powerful families, secured alliances, and exploited divisions among Greek city-states. In 338 BC, at the Battle of Chaeronea, his army defeated the combined forces of Athens and Thebes. The phalanx held firm, while cavalry smashed the enemy flank. Even the sacred band of Thebes, an elite unit of 300 warriors, famed for loyalty and courage, was annihilated. Greek independence ended in a single day. Philip declared a new order, the League of Corinth. All Greek states except Sparta were bound into alliance under his command. For the first time, Greece was united, though not by choice. Philip positioned himself as hegemon supreme commander of a pan-Hellenic campaign against Persia. It was both revenge for past invasions and opportunity for plunder. The Persian Empire remained vast, but weakened its wealth ripe for conquest. Yet fate intervened. In 336 BC, on the eve of launching this grand campaign, Philip was assassinated. Accounts vary. Some blame court rivals, others suggest conspiracy, but his death left a fragile throne. His successor was his 20-year-old son, Alexander. Brilliant, restless, and tutored by Aristotle himself, Alexander had already proved his mettle-commanding cavalry at Chæronea. Now he inherited both a throne and a dream to conquer Persia. The young king faced immediate challenges. Rivals within Macedonia plotted, while Greek city-states sensed weakness. But Alexander acted decisively. He eliminated potential threats at home and marched south. When Thebes rebelled, he destroyed the city entirely, selling survivors into slavery. The message was unmistakable. Alexander would not hesitate. By spring 334 BC, Alexander was ready. He gathered an army of 4,000 and prepared to cross into Asia. At Troy, he visited the tomb of Achilles, his boyhood hero offering sacrifice and claiming kinship with the greatest warrior of myth. For his men, it was inspiration. For Persians, it was warning. The son of Philip was not content to inherit Macedonia. He intended to rule the world. The story of Alexander begins here, with a young king, a restless people, and an empire waiting across the sea. Few suspected how far his ambition would carry him, or how quickly he would change history. Alexander's army in 334 BC numbered around 40,000. It was small compared to the Persian hosts he would face, yet it was disciplined, innovative, and loyal. At its core stood 9,000 Macedonian phalangites, veterans, armed with the sarissa. Each pike stretched 18 feet, double the reach of ordinary Greek spears. In battle, they formed a wall of sharpened points, 16 men deep, a fortress of flesh and wood. It was nearly unstoppable from the front, though vulnerable at flanks and rear. Guarding the phalanx's edges were 3,000 elite infantry known as hypaspists or shield-bearers. They wielded shorter spears and heavier shields, giving flexibility where the phalanx lacked. Their commander was Nicanor, son of Parmenion. Behind the phalanx stood allies 7,000 Greek hoplites and 5,000 mercenaries, armed in the traditional style with 8-foot spears and large round shields. Though less effective than Macedonians, they were still formidable. Skirmishers added mobility. The Agrianes from modern Bulgaria were expert javelin throwers. Thracians and Illyrians carried slings and bows. These troops harassed enemies before heavy infantry clashed. Yet the shock force of Alexander's army was cavalry. His companion cavalry numbered about 1,800. These horsemen, armed with spear and sword, fought close to Alexander himself. They formed the decisive arm, striking at weak points and breaking enemy lines. The king personally led the royal squadron, ensuring loyalty and inspiring courage. Supporting them were Thessalian cavalry, 1,800 strong, commanded by Callus. Another 600 came from allied Greek states, under Erigaius. 900 mounted scouts from Thrace and Paeonia under Cassander screened movements. Together, cavalry and infantry gave Alexander a balanced force. It was not the largest army in the ancient world, but perhaps the best drilled. In spring 334 BC, Alexander led this force across the Hellespont, the narrow strait separating Europe and Asia. Ancient writers describe him stopping at Troy, where he sacrificed at the tomb of Achilles. He laid a wreath on the hero's grave and exchanged his armor for relics, said to have belonged to the warrior. To his men it symbolized divine favor. To Alexander, it was a personal claim. Like Achilles, he sought eternal glory, even at the price of a short life. The Persians waited. Their governors in Asia Minor, satraps, ruling provinces from the Aegean to the interior, assembled an army to block him at the river Granicus. Memnon of Rhodes, a Greek general serving Persia, urged caution. He advised burning crops, retreating inland, and starving Alexander's army. It was sound strategy, but satraps refused. They would not torch their own provinces without a fight. Instead, they formed at the river. The Granicus was shallow, about 60 feet wide, with steep bank. On the far side, 10,000 Persian cavalry massed, drawn from every corner of the empire, Medes from Iran, Bactrians from Afghanistan, Paphlagonians from Turkey's Black Sea coast. Behind them stood Greek mercenaries, hoplites, fighting for Persian gold. Suspicion lingered about their loyalty, so Persians placed them in reserve. Alexander's force was outnumbered, with 13,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry ready to cross. Parmenion, his veteran general, advised waiting until dawn, but Alexander refused. He ordered an immediate assault. On his left wing, Thessalian, Greek, and Thracian cavalry stood under Parmenion's command. In the center, the phalanx waited in disciplined silence. On the right, Alexander himself led the companions, the hypaspists, the Agrianes, and archers. The first charge came from a squadron of companions, splashing into the river, followed by hypaspists and Paeonian cavalry. As they reached midstream, javelins and arrows rained down. Horses reared, men fell, shields clashed against currents. Those who reached the far bank were met by Persian cavalry, who charged downhill with momentum. The river became chaos water, churning red with blood. Alexander rode in at the head of his companions. He aimed for the thickest part of the Persian line, where nobles and commanders clustered. Horses slammed against horses, spears shattered, men grappled hand to hand. In the confusion, Persian noble Rosas struck Alexander on the head, breaking a piece of his helmet. The king staggered but recovered, driving his lance into his attacker. Another noble, Spithridates, swung from behind, sword raised to kill him. At that instant, Clytus the Black, one of Alexander's closest companions, cut off Spithridates' arm before the blade fell. The king lived by inches. Meanwhile, the phalanx crossed. 6 divisions under commanders Perdiccas, Koinos, Amintus, Philip Meleger, and Crateros advanced through the river. Their sarissas bristled like a moving forest. Persian cavalry facing this wall faltered. Many turned to flee. The Greek mercenaries still in reserve were left isolated. Alexander encircled them. Despite pleas for mercy, he ordered slaughter. Ancient sources suggest thousands were killed, a grim warning to other Greeks serving Persia. The battle ended in decisive victory. Persia's western satrapies lay open. Alexander had proven his courage, his army's discipline, and the effectiveness of Macedonian tactics. Yet the risk was clear. At Granicus he had nearly died. His men saw both his recklessness and his destiny. Asia Minor now awaited conquest, and the Persian Empire, still immense, was beginning to stir. After the shock at Granicus, the road into Asia Minor lay open. Persian commanders, shaken by the sudden loss, abandoned strongholds rather than face Alexander again. Sardis, capital of Lydia, and once a proud city of the Persian satrapy, surrendered without resistance. Its treasury, rich with silver, fell into Macedonian hands. Alexander treated the city leniently, confirming local laws and religion, a strategy that earned him loyalty. Conquest came not only by sword but by policy. From Sardis he advanced south to Miletus, a port fortified with Persian ships. Memnon of Rhodes, the Greek general serving Persia, still believed naval strength offered the empire its best chance. Persia commanded the greatest fleet in the eastern Mediterranean. If it cut Alexander's supply lines back to Greece, his campaign could collapse. But Alexander avoided sea battles. Instead, he besieged coastal strongholds one by one. At Miletus, after fierce resistance, the city fell. Memnon retreated, regrouping for another stand. Next came Halicarnassus, another fortified city on the coast. Memnon prepared towers, walls, and Persian garrisons. The siege dragged into winter. Macedonian sappers dug beneath walls while defenders launched fireships against Alexander's engines. At one point, Persians nearly broke into his camp, but hypaspists counterattacked, driving them back. After months, the defenders fled. Fires consumed parts of the city, leaving ruins that testified to both sides' determination. Alexander's army wintered among ashes, hardened by the ordeal. In spring 333 BC, he marched inland through Lycia and Phrygia. At Gordium, he encountered the fabled Gordian knot. Legend claimed that whoever could untie the intricate knot of cords would rule Asia. Before a watching crowd, Alexander approached the knot. Unable to find the ends, he drew his sword and sliced through it. The act shocked some, impressed others, but all understood the message. Alexander would not wait for destiny to unravel slowly. He would seize it by force. Meanwhile, Memnon struck back. Leading Persian fleets, he captured the islands of Chios and Lesbos, threatening the Aegean and even Alexander's Greek homeland. For a moment, the tide seemed to turn, but fortune intervened. Memnon died suddenly of illness, and with him, Persian naval strategy collapsed. Without his leadership, Persian satraps quarreled and hesitated. The empire's vast resources remained formidable, but coordination faltered. Alexander pressed forward. In Cilicia, near the coast of modern Turkey, his men struggled through narrow mountain passes. The heat was brutal, and the army suffered exhaustion. At Tarsus, Alexander himself fell ill after bathing in icy waters of the Cydnus River. Some believed poison was involved, fearing treachery. His physician, Philip of Acarnania, prepared a risky draught. According to ancient accounts, Alexander drank it while handing Philip a letter accusing him of conspiracy. Trust prevailed, and the king recovered his survival, reinforcing belief in divine favor. The Persian king, Darius III, now took command in person. Gathering an army perhaps twice Alexander's size, he marched to cut off the Macedonians. Instead of waiting deeper inland, Darius swung behind Alexander, blocking his retreat to the coast. The two forces closed near Issus, where mountains pressed against the Mediterranean. The battlefield was narrow, just 6 miles from ridge to sea. Darius's numerical advantage was blunted by terrain. As the armies drew close, Alexander addressed his men by name. He reminded veterans of victories at Chaeronea and Granicus, urging them to fight not only for themselves but for Greece, for honor, and for glory that would echo forever. Morale surged. For many, the moment felt like destiny. They were about to face the great king himself, ruler of the largest empire the world had ever known. The stage was set. On one side, Darius with perhaps 100,000 troops, his immortals elite household guards, mercenaries, cavalry and archers from every corner of Persia. On the other, Alexander commanding perhaps 40,000, yet bound by training, innovation, and the will of their young king. At Issus, 2 worlds prepared to clash. One represented ancient imperial wealth and tradition. The other embodied restless ambition, sharpened by reform and genius. The outcome would decide not only Asia Minor, but the future course of the known world. The plain near Issus, hemmed between mountains and sea, forced Darius to compress his enormous army. Estimates from ancient sources reach 100,000 men, though modern historians suggest fewer. Still, Alexander faced a foe at least twice his size. The Persian king placed his best cavalry on the right, closest to the shoreline where the terrain favored horses. Greek mercenary hoplites held the center, while infantry from across the empire stretched toward the hills. Darius himself commanded from a high chariot, surrounded by 10,000 immortals, his household guard. Alexander arranged his line with precision. On the left, near the sea, Parmenion led Thessalian cavalry and allied Greeks. In the center, the phalanx stood ready, sarissas bristling. On the right, near the foothills, Alexander placed himself with the companions, hypaspists, archers, and elite javelin throwers. He had reinforced Parmenion's vulnerable wing with Thessalian cavalry, but his main strike would come from the right. The battle began with Alexander advancing swiftly. His right wing surged forward, the companions charging with speed that stunned Persian cavalry. Hooves thundered, lances pierced, and chaos erupted as the Macedonians drove deep. In the center, the phalanx pressed against Persian mercenaries. Yet the formation's stretched gaps opened, and Greek hoplites fighting for Persia began to push them back. The Macedonian line risked breaking. Seeing danger, Alexander shifted. He regrouped his cavalry, then hurled them directly at the Persian center, aiming for Darius himself. The impact was ferocious. Horses crashed into men, iron-tipped sarissas drove through shields, and the once solid Persian center buckled. As Alexander cut a path toward the royal chariot, panic rippled through the Persian ranks. Darius, confronted by the sudden advance, chose flight. He abandoned his family, his chariot, and the battlefield, racing eastward with his guards. On the left, Parmenion fought desperately. Persian cavalry pressed hard, threatening to envelop his flank. The Thessalians held disciplined and stubborn, preventing collapse. Once word spread that Darius had fled, Persian morale crumbled. Soldiers abandoned weapons, fleeing across narrow ground, many trampled in the rush. The battle became slaughter. Ancient accounts claim bodies filled ravines so tightly, Macedonians crossed them as bridges. Amid the wreckage, Alexander discovered an unexpected prize, the family of Darius. His mother, wife, and children had been captured alive. Instead of cruelty, Alexander treated them with respect. He assured Darius's wife of her safety and offered the royal family continued honor. This mercy contrasted with the slaughter of mercenaries at Granicus. It also served politics. Alexander now appeared not merely as invader, but as legitimate successor, a ruler who could claim kingship of Persia. The victory at Issus stunned the world. A young Macedonian commanding far fewer men had twice defeated the Persian Empire in pitched battles. His image spread quickly, fearless, audacious, almost touched by the divine. For Greeks, Issus avenged centuries of Persian invasions. For Persians, it was humiliation, their king fleeing while family fell captive. For Alexander, it was proof of destiny. After the battle, Darius sent envoys offering peace ransom for his family and even vast territory west of the Euphrates. Alexander refused. He wanted nothing less than the entire empire. The capture of Darius's family gave him leverage, and his growing legend gave him momentum. His gaze turned south toward Phoenicia and its great cities, where Persian naval power still lingered. To secure the coast, he would face sieges as brutal as any battle. Issus marked a turning point. No longer was Alexander only punishing satraps or marching through provinces. He had challenged the great king directly, and triumphed. The struggle had shifted from border skirmishes to a war for the empire itself. The fate of Persia and perhaps the entire known world now hinged on whether Alexander's momentum could continue. With Darius in flight and his family in captivity, Alexander pushed south toward the Phoenician coast. Control of this region mattered for more than prestige. Persian naval power supplied from ports along the Levant still threatened his supply lines. To secure the empire, Alexander had to neutralize the fleet by seizing its bases. One by one, cities opened their gates. By 332 BC, most Phoenician ports submitted quickly. Calculating survival was better than defiance. But the island city of Tyre refused. Tyre stood half a mile offshore, protected by towering walls and a powerful fleet. Its defenders mocked Alexander, believing their city unassailable. Yet the Macedonian king refused to leave it unconquered. He ordered a massive engineering project, a causeway from mainland to island. Workers hauled stones, wood, and rubble, dumping them into the sea. Slowly, a land bridge began to rise. Tyrians countered with fire ships, sending blazing hulls into Macedonian siege towers. Flames engulfed engines, collapsing structures in smoke and screams. Alexander responded with persistence. He built larger towers fitted with catapults and protective hides. Archers rained arrows as laborers extended the mole further into the sea. Tyrian divers sabotaged foundations, pulling stones away. The struggle dragged for 7 months, a war of attrition as much as strategy. Finally, with causeway complete, Macedonian towers rolled up to the walls. Battering rams pounded relentlessly. At last, a breach opened. The assault was brutal. Macedonian soldiers poured through gaps, companions stormed from ships, and Tyrian streets turned into killing grounds. Ancient accounts say thousands were slaughtered. 2,000 defenders were crucified along the shoreline as warning, while women and children were sold into slavery. The once proud island fortress, a jewel of Phoenicia, lay shattered. For Alexander, the fall of Tyre was both triumph and terror-proof that no city could resist him for long. From Tyre he marched south to Gaza. Perched on high ground, the city resisted fiercely. Siege towers advanced, but defenders toppled them. Alexander himself was wounded by a projectile, yet remained at the front. After months, Gaza fell. Its commander Batis was captured. Ancient writers claim Alexander, enraged at the delay, dragged Batis behind a chariot, echoing Achilles' treatment of Hector. Whether myth or fact, the story reinforced Alexander's image as both ruthless and relentless. With Gaza subdued, the road to Egypt lay open. Persian satraps no longer had strength to resist. At Pelusium, gateway to the Nile, Delta officials surrendered. The entire province passed into Alexander's hands without battle. For Egyptians weary of Persian domination, he appeared as liberator rather than conqueror. Temples opened, priests welcomed him, and the crown of Pharaoh was placed upon his head at Memphis. Alexander's policy was deliberate. In Egypt, he did not impose Macedonian gods, but honored native traditions. He sacrificed to Apis the sacred bull and restored shrines. This earned loyalty and reinforced legitimacy. At the Nile Delta, he marked out a new city, Alexandria. Designed as a Greek metropolis with harbors, temples, and theaters, it would grow into one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. Seeking divine confirmation, Alexander traveled west to the Siwa oasis. There, at the oracle of Amun priests, greeted him as son of the god. Ancient sources differ on what words were spoken, but Alexander left convinced of his divine ancestry. To his men, he was still their commander. To himself, he now carried the aura of divinity, a belief that would only deepen as his power expanded. The conquest of Egypt completed another chapter. In just 2 years, Alexander had defeated satraps at Granicus, humbled Darius at Issus, stormed Tyre after 7 months, and been crowned pharaoh in Memphis. From Asia Minor to the Nile, he was master. Yet Persia's heart still lay ahead. Darius remained on the throne, gathering new armies. To rule as more than conqueror Alexander would have, to crush the great king in a final showdown. That moment was approaching. While Alexander ruled as pharaoh in Egypt, trouble brewed back in Greece. Not all city-states accepted Macedonian dominance quietly. In 331 BC, King Aegeis III of Sparta, long resentful of Macedonia, rose in revolt. He sought Persian gold and support, hoping to ignite a general Greek uprising. For a moment it seemed possible. Athens hesitated, watching carefully, but Sparta rallied allies from the Peloponnese. At that time, Alexander was far from home, consolidating Egypt and planning to march east. Control of Greece lay with his regent Antipater, an older general seasoned by decades of war. Antipater gathered Macedonian forces and marched south to confront Aegeis. Near Megalopolis, in the heart of the Peloponnese, the two armies clashed. Despite Spartan courage, they faced a reformed Macedonian phalanx and disciplined cavalry. Aegeis fought with legendary valor, refusing to retreat even when mortally wounded. According to ancient accounts, he ordered comrades to leave him and save themselves. Sparta was crushed. Aegeis lay among the fallen, and Macedonian authority in Greece was secured again. News of Sparta's defeat reached Alexander as he prepared for his greatest challenge yet. Darius, humiliated at Issus, had raised another massive army. This one dwarfed anything Alexander had faced. Ancient sources speak of hundreds of thousands of soldiers, though modern estimates suggest between 50 and 80,000. The Persians cleared and leveled ground near Gaugamela in today's northern Iraq to prepare for war chariots. They brought scythed chariots, war elephants, and cavalry from across the empire. Darius chose this field, deliberately maximizing his advantage in numbers and mobility. Alexander advanced, with perhaps 47,000 men. His veterans were seasoned yet weary. They had marched for years, crossing rivers, mountains, and deserts. Still, loyalty to their king bound them. Alexander planned carefully. He arranged his army with unusual depth, refusing his flanks back at an angle to prevent encirclement. In the center stood the phalanx, steady as ever, commanded by his trusted officers. On the left, Parmenion held the cavalry and allied Greeks. On the right, Alexander positioned himself with the companions, the hypaspists, and his most reliable troops. On the night before battle, stories claim Alexander slept soundly while Darius remained anxious. To his men, it showed divine confidence. At dawn, the two armies prepared. Dust rose in clouds as Persian horsemen moved into position. War chariots gleamed with scythes attached to their wheels. Elephants trumpeted unsettling Macedonian horses, unused to the sight. Darius, in royal robes, oversaw the field from a high chariot surrounded by immortals. The battle began with skirmishers and cavalry probes. Then Darius unleashed his scythed chariots, thundering toward the Macedonian line. But Alexander had prepared lanes in his formation. Light infantry opened gaps, showering the chariots with javelins, then closing ranks behind them. The deadly machines passed harmlessly through horses, pierced drivers slain. As the chariots failed, Alexander executed his main maneuver. He led his right wing outward, seemingly retreating. The Persians mirrored shifting troops to outflank him. This thinned their center. At the perfect moment, Alexander wheeled back, launching the companions straight at Darius. The charge was ferocious. Sarissus pierced shields, cavalry smashed into infantry, and panic rippled across the Persian center. Darius, once more confronted by Alexander's advance, fled in his chariot. His flight shattered Persian morale. The center broke soldiers abandoning positions in terror, yet the battle was not over. On the left, Parmenion faced overwhelming cavalry attacks. Indian and Scythian horsemen even broke through to the Macedonian camp. Messengers rode to Alexander begging for help. He abandoned pursuit of Darius and turned back. Fighting on the Persian right was savage, costing 60 of his elite companions. Finally, with news spreading that the king had fled, the Persian wings collapsed. Survivors scattered across the plain. The Battle of Gaugamela was decisive. Ancient writers claim Alexander lost only a few hundred men, while Persians suffered tens of thousands. Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis now lay open. The Persian Empire, centuries old, was broken in a single day. When Alexander entered Babylon, crowds lined the streets to welcome him. He offered sacrifices to Marduk, honoring local gods, and accepted the city without bloodshed. At Susa, he seized an immense treasury wealth unimaginable even to Greeks. Gold and silver poured into Macedonian hands, funding campaigns to come. In one stroke, Alexander controlled the richest cities of Persia. Yet his conquest was not complete. Darius still lived, retreating into the east to raise new forces. And in the mountains ahead, Persian resistance stiffened. Alexander had destroyed Persia's main army, but now he would confront the vastness of the empire itself. His campaign was only halfway finished. After Gaugamela, the road to the Persian heartland lay open. Alexander marched first to the Zagros Mountains, where defenders at the Persian gates tried to block him. For a month, local forces resisted using narrow passes to hold off the invader. But Macedonians found a path around the mountains, encircled the defenders, and slaughtered them. The route to Persia's ceremonial capital, Persepolis, was clear. In early 330 BC, Alexander entered Persepolis. The city dazzled even seasoned soldiers. Terraces, halls, and palaces displayed the wealth of generations of Persian kings. Reliefs on stone staircases showed delegations from across the empire, bringing tribute, gold, textiles, animals, even exotic gifts like ivory. Here stood the throne of Persia, symbol of centuries of rule. At first, Alexander behaved as liberator. He offered sacrifices, spared temples, and signaled respect for local traditions. But resentment among Greeks burned hot. They remembered 480 BC when Persians had burned Athens' temples. Now voices urged revenge. Soon, Alexander allowed his men to loot Persepolis. Palaces filled with treasures were ransacked. Gold and silver ornaments, vessels and statues were hauled away. Then, during a drunken celebration, the royal palace was set ablaze. Some say it was accident. Others claim Alexander ordered it deliberately as vengeance for Athens. Ancient accounts describe flames lighting the night, consuming cedar beams, and leaving blackened ruins. Persepolis, jewel of Persia, became ashes. This act shocked many. For Persians, it proved Alexander was no savior but a conqueror. Even Greeks wondered at the destruction of such splendor. Yet the fire etched a message into history. Greece had avenged its humiliation, and Alexander had claimed supremacy over Persia. Meanwhile, Darius retreated north to Ecbatana, still hoping to raise a new army. Loyalists gathered, but unity fractured. Among his governors was Bessus, satrap of Bactria. Ambitious and wary of defeat, Bessus plotted betrayal. As Alexander closed in, Darius's own men seized him. When Macedonians approached Bessus and his accomplices stabbed the great king, leaving him to die in a cart, Alexander soon found Darius's body. Ancient writers record that the Macedonian king wept, covering the corpse with his cloak. He ordered a royal burial at Persepolis, among the ancestors of the Achaemenids. In this act, Alexander claimed not only conquest, but succession. He declared himself rightful king of Asia, heir to both Persian and Macedonian thrones. By honoring Darius, he positioned himself as legitimate ruler rather than foreign destroyer. The murder of Darius transformed the war. No longer could Alexander be seen as liberator fighting Persia's tyrant. Now he was the monarch of a vast empire, challenged by rebels and pretenders. Bessus proclaimed himself new king in the east, adopting the royal title Artaxerxes. For Alexander, this was both insult and opportunity. He would march east to hunt down the usurper, proving his authority over every satrapy. But his army had marched thousands of miles. Many hoped for rest after Babylon, Susa, and Persepolis. Instead, Alexander pressed onward. He reorganized his empire, appointing satraps, often retaining Persians in office if they swore loyalty. He collected taxes, paid debts of soldiers, and distributed wealth seized from treasuries. Still, tension grew. Macedonians wondered whether their king sought glory without end, turning from Greece toward unknown horizons. Alexander himself seemed driven by something more than conquest. At Troy, he had claimed kinship with Achilles. At Siwa, he had been called son of Amun. Now, with Darius gone, he saw himself as world ruler, destined for greatness beyond mortal limits. The boundaries of ambition no longer stopped at the Euphrates, or even Persepolis. His vision extended east into lands barely known to Greeks. Thus, the fall of Persepolis and the death of Darius marked a turning point. Alexander was no longer the avenger of Greece. He was the new king of Persia, burdened with both crown and responsibility. Ahead lay Bactria, Sogdia, and the frontiers of Central Asia, where revolt, resistance, and betrayal awaited. The chase for Bessus would test his army's endurance and his own claim to rule. With Darius dead, Alexander turned east to confront Bessus the satrap who had betrayed his king and claimed the Persian crown. His march took him into regions unfamiliar to most Greeks, across deserts and mountains that stretched toward Central Asia. The campaign was less a war of pitched battles than a pursuit of rebels and the taming of provinces long accustomed to resisting central power. His first challenge came in Arya, modern Afghanistan. Satibarzanes, the local governor, initially submitted, then rebelled once Alexander moved forward. The revolt threatened to inspire others. Alexander reacted quickly, marching back with speed that stunned enemies. In single combat, one of his officers killed Satibarzanes. The rebellion collapsed. To secure the region, Alexander founded a new city, Alexandria Ariana, at the site of modern Herat. It became one of many settlements bearing his name, meant to garrison troops, spread Greek culture, and anchor his rule across vast distances. But the deeper Alexander pushed east, the more fragile his own camp became. The Macedonian court had a long tradition of intrigue and assassination. 6 years earlier, Alexander's father, Philip II, had fallen to a bodyguard's blade. Now rumors spread of plots against the young king. The most serious involved Philotas, commander of the companion cavalry, and son of Parmenion Alexander's most trusted general. Philotas was accused of knowing about a conspiracy, but failing to report it. Under torture he confessed, though whether truth or forced admission remains debated. Alexander ordered his execution. Then came the darker step. Fearing Parmenion might avenge his son, Alexander sent assassins to Ecbatana, where the old general governed. Without warning, Parmenion was killed, struck down after decades of loyal service. These acts chilled the army. Parmenion had guided Philip and Alexander through countless campaigns. His death signaled a shift. Alexander, once first among equals, now seemed absolute monarch, intolerant of dissent. Veterans whispered uneasily. They had followed him across continents, but now saw ambition hardened into suspicion. Meanwhile, the pursuit of Bessus continued. In 329 BC, Alexander founded Alexandria Arachosia, modern Kandahar, securing another frontier. As he pushed north toward the Oxus River, Bessus's own men betrayed him, binding him and handing him over. Alexander sent him back west for execution, as a kingslayer punished both for murder and usurpation. But the rebellion did not end. In Sogdia, modern Uzbekistan and Tajikistan, local tribes resisted fiercely, launching raids and ambushes. Alexander's army found itself bogged down in a guerrilla war, unlike the set-piece battles of Granicus or Gaugamela. The terrain tested endurance. Steppes stretched endless rivers, cut deep valleys, and mountains rose harsh against the horizon. Supply lines strained, morale weakened. Soldiers who had once dreamed of plunder in Babylon now faced years of fighting in remote fortresses. Some asked how far their king intended to march. Home lay thousands of miles behind. Ahead was only the unknown. Alexander himself grew harder. In Marakanda, modern Samarkand, he quarreled drunkenly with Clytus the Black, the officer who had once saved his life at Granicus. In a rage, Alexander killed him with a spear. Horror spread through camp. The king wept afterward, grief-stricken, but trust had been shaken. His men began to wonder whether their leader, now hailed as son of gods, remained one of them. Yet Alexander pressed on. He built more Alexandria's imposed garrisons, and attempted to blend cultures by wearing Persian dress and adopting certain court rituals. To Macedonians, these gestures seemed betrayal of Greek traditions. To Persians, they were signs of legitimacy. Alexander walked a line between two worlds, neither fully Macedonian nor entirely Persian, but something new. The death of Darius had ended one empire, but the actions that followed, executions, suspicion, ruthless campaigns, reshaped Alexander's own. The dream of liberating Greeks had become a mission of personal dominion. His men marched east, not for revenge, but for a king who seemed determined to reach the edge of the world. How far could loyalty stretch before breaking? The rugged lands of Sogdia proved as dangerous as any battlefield. Unlike the plains of Gaugamela, where armies clashed in open order, here Alexander faced tribes skilled in ambush, deception, and guerrilla tactic. Every valley concealed fighters. Every mountain fortress bristled with resistance. To the Macedonians weary from years of marching, it felt like endless war against shadows. One stronghold became legendary, the Rock of Sogdia. Rising sheer above the plains, its defenders taunted Alexander, claiming he would need men with wings to capture it. The king turned challenge into opportunity. He called for volunteers among his soldiers, skilled in climbing. 300 scaled the cliffs at night, using tent pegs and ropes. By dawn they appeared above the fortress. When defenders looked up and saw the winged men, they surrendered without a fight. This spectacle showed Alexander's daring, but also his demand for absolute ingenuity from his army. Another fortress, the Rock of Coriens, resisted for months. Supplies dwindled, yet Macedonians pressed on. Alexander negotiated directly with its ruler, convincing him of mercy if he submitted. The stronghold fell, and with it a measure of stability in the region. But victory came at high cost. Raids continued, and soldiers questioned whether endless sieges in remote lands were worth their lives. Amid war, politics intertwined with personal life. In 327 BC, Alexander met Roxana, daughter of a Bactrian noble. Ancient accounts describe her as strikingly beautiful. Their marriage was more than passion. It secured loyalty from local elites and symbolized union between conqueror and conquered. Macedonian officers grumbled uneasy with their king marrying a barbarian. Yet for Alexander the match blended politics with desire. In Roxana he found both ally and companion, though tensions between cultures deepened. The marriage also marked Alexander's shift in identity. He adopted more Persian customs, dressing in robes, and practicing court rituals like proskinesis, the act of bowing before the king. To Greeks and Macedonians, this was blasphemy. Such reverence belonged only to gods. Resistance flared among his companions. Some complied reluctantly, others refused outright, risking the king's wrath. In this atmosphere, plots emerged. A royal page named Hermolaus, angered by punishment for a minor offense, conspired with others to assassinate Alexander. The plot was discovered. Under torture, conspirators confessed. They were stoned to death. Callisthenes, Alexander's official historian and relative of Aristotle, was implicated for encouraging criticism of royal arrogance. He was imprisoned and later died, perhaps executed. These events reinforced fear. Alexander no longer tolerated dissent. What began as camaraderie among equals now resembled monarchy absolute and unquestioned. Despite unrest, campaigns pressed forward. Alexander founded more cities, outposts of Greek language, culture, and soldiers' families. These settlements, small at first, became hubs for trade and governance. They also symbolized permanence. Alexander did not intend to raid and leave. He meant to rule. To Macedonians, this was both inspiring and exhausting. To Persians and local tribes, it signaled the arrival of a new order that fused east and west. Yet victories in Sogdia came slowly, and losses mounted. Supplies ran low, climate-strained bodies, and distance from home weighed heavily. Veterans who once cheered at Troy now muttered of endless conquest. Alexander's vision, boundless and relentless, seemed to stretch further than human endurance. In these struggles his identity evolved. He was no longer just the son of Philip, heir of Macedonia. He was Pharaoh of Egypt, king of Persia, lord of Asia, and now husband of a Bactrian princess. Each title carried weight, but together they transformed him into something new. A ruler whose ambition recognized no borders. Still questions lingered among his men. How far would he go? Was there an end to conquest, or would they march forever into unknown lands? The mutterings foreshadowed conflict yet to come, when even loyal veterans would challenge their king's insatiable drive. By 327 BC, Alexander turned his gaze beyond Bactria and Sogdia. Ahead lay the towering Hindu Kush gateway to the Indus Valley. Greek geographers described distant India as a land of wealth, strange beasts and rivers at the edge of the world. For his men, the prospect of another campaign across mountains and deserts stirred both awe and dread. They had marched for 7 years, fought countless battles, and still the king demanded more. Crossing the Hindu Kush was brutal. Snow choked narrow passes. Supplies ran thin. Men wrapped themselves in animal hides to fight freezing winds. Horses slipped on icy paths, tumbling into ravines. Many died of exposure, yet Alexander pressed on, pushing columns across the mountains. He knew hesitation would embolden enemies and weaken morale. To turn back was impossible. To advance meant survival. In the Swat Valley, his forces met fierce resistance from tribes known as the Aspaceae and Assassini. Villages turned into fortresses. At Massaga, the Assassinian capital defenders resisted behind high walls. Ancient accounts speak of a queen named Cleophas, said to have ruled during the siege. After days of bloody fighting, Macedonians broke through. The city fell, but legends tell that Cleophas was spared, even treated with honor, possibly bearing Alexander a son. Whether myth or fact, the story reinforced his aura as conqueror entwined with destiny. From Massaga, Alexander moved deeper. Tribes fought with desperation, ambushing columns in narrow valleys. Macedonians answered with relentless assaults, destroying towns, enslaving survivors, and leaving smoking ruins. The brutality spread fear, but also hardened opposition. In every new valley, Alexander confronted the paradox of empire conquest, brought submission, but also bred resentment that demanded endless suppression, despite bloodshed alliances formed. At Taxila, near modern Islamabad, King Omphis, often called Taxiles, chose diplomacy. He welcomed Alexander, offering elephants, soldiers, and supplies. For Alexander, this was opportunity. Taxila became staging ground for greater conflict. For the first time, Indian kings joined his ranks, swelling his army with local support. The alliance also foreshadowed tension as new allies brought ambitions of their own. Beyond Taxila loomed his greatest test in India, King Porus, of the Pauravas, ruler of land between the Jhelum and Chenab rivers. Porus commanded elephants, beasts, alien to Greek warfare. To Alexander's veterans, scarred from years of battle, the prospect of facing war elephants was terrifying. Accounts told of tusked giants trampling men and horses, unstoppable in charge. Yet Alexander resolved to confront Porus directly. He would not bypass strong foes. His strategy was always to face power head-on, crushing resistance before it could grow. As summer rains swelled rivers, Alexander's army prepared for the crossing of the Hydaspes' modern Jhelum. The river ran wide and swift, swollen with monsoon waters. Porus waited on the far bank with infantry, cavalry, and perhaps 200 elephants. The standoff mirrored earlier confrontations with Persia. Alexander outnumbered, facing unfamiliar weapons, yet confident in his skill. To distract Porus, Alexander camped openly along the riverbank. Night after night, he marched troops up and down, feigning attempts to cross. Porus mirrored his moves, shadowing him. Then, in a stormy night, Alexander struck. Leading a picked force, he marched upstream, found an island in the river, and crossed in darkness. Rain lashed men, and horses' thunder roared, but they reached the far bank undetected. At dawn, Porus discovered too late that his enemy had crossed. The stage was set for one of antiquity's most remarkable battles. On a plain drenched with rain, Macedonian sarissas would soon face elephants thundering in formation. For Alexander, Hydaspes would prove both his tactical brilliance and the limits of conquest. For his soldiers, it would test courage against creatures they had never imagined in war. At dawn, in 326 BC, the battlefield of the Hydaspes lay soaked by monsoon rains. Alexander had crossed the swollen river with a chosen force, leaving Crateros with reserves to distract Porus downstream. When Porus realized his enemy stood on his flank, he marched to meet them. His army included thousands of infantry-skilled cavalry and a terrifying formation of war elephants. Ancient accounts describe nearly 200 elephants, each armored tusks, tipped with iron towers mounted on their backs. For Macedonians who had never fought such beasts, the sight was awe and terror combined. Alexander placed cavalry on his wings, phalanx in the center. As the two armies closed, elephants thundered forward. Their charge crushed men, split lines, and terrified horses. Sarissus struck, but many shattered against thick hides. Some elephants rampaged uncontrollably, trampling friend and foe alike. The battlefield became chaos men, screaming under hooves phalangites, struggling to maintain formation. Alexander countered with mobility. Cavalry struck Porus's flanks, darting in and out, avoiding elephant charges. Archers aimed at drivers and mahouts, knowing beasts without guidance could panic. Slowly discipline turned chaos into order. Macedonians killed some elephants, wounded others until they bolted. The tide shifted, but at heavy cost. Ancient sources describe Hydaspes as one of Alexander's bloodiest victories, with thousands dead on both sides. In the center, Porus fought with towering courage. Mounted on his own elephant, he directed troops even as arrows and javelins struck around him. Wounded, he refused to retreat. His determination impressed even his enemies. At last, surrounded and bleeding Porus was brought before Alexander. When asked how he wished to be treated, he replied simply, "As a king." Alexander admired such dignity. Rather than humiliating Porus, he restored him to rule and even granted him more territory. This act blended mercy with strategy. By honoring Porus, Alexander secured loyalty in Punjab and demonstrated to other Indian rulers that resistance would be met with force, but dignity could be preserved through submission. It was politics wrapped in magnanimity, an approach that extended his influence without endless fighting. The victory at Hydaspes opened the Punjab to Macedonian control. Cities submitted, alliances shifted, and Alexander's legend deepened. Yet the cost haunted his army. The battle had been harder than Granicus Issus or even Gaugamela. Elephants had inflicted horrors unseen before, crushed bodies, screaming horses, soldiers pinned beneath beasts. Veterans whispered of what lay further east. Rumors spread of Indian kings commanding armies many times larger, with thousands of elephants. For the first time, Alexander faced not only enemies, but the limits of his men's endurance. They had marched from Greece through Asia Minor, across deserts, through mountains, and into India. Now, after 8 years of war, they saw no end. The dream of reaching the great river at the edge of the world felt less glorious and more impossible. Alexander, however, still hungered for more. He envisioned reaching the Ganges, conquering lands no Greek had seen. His ambition seemed infinite, fueled by belief in divine destiny. But his soldiers, weary and scarred, began to resist. Hydaspes had shown that victories would come at ever greater cost. The king's will had carried them across continents, but their breaking point was near. The victory over Porus did not quench Alexander's ambition. Instead, it sharpened his desire to press further east. Stories reached him of kingdoms beyond the Punjab, of armies numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and of rivers so vast they seemed oceans. For Alexander, these tales were not warnings, but invitations. He dreamed of reaching the Ganges, which Greek geographers believed flowed at the edge of the world. In the summer of 326 BC, the army marched deeper into India. Monsoon rains turned roads into rivers of mud. Supply lines stretched villages emptied before their advance, and men trudged through waterlogged fields. The elephants of Porus now marched with them, reminders of Hydaspes, but also symbols of what lay ahead. Soldiers whispered about greater herds, waiting further east, enough to crush any phalanx. At last they reached the river Hyphasis, known today as the Bias. Wide, swift, and swollen by rains, it marked a boundary both physical and psychological. Alexander assembled his commanders, laying out plans to cross and continue into India. He spoke of glory of conquering lands no Greek had ever seen, of writing their names in history beside gods and heroes. For him there was no limit, but his men had reached theirs. They had marched thousands of miles, fought countless battles, and not seen home in 8 years. They had buried friends in Asia Minor, Mesopotamia, Persia, Bactria, and now India. They faced storms, deserts, and jungles. Ahead lay rumors of armies larger than anything encountered, supported by thousands of elephants. Fear and exhaustion hardened into refusal. At first, silence greeted Alexander's appeal. Then, murmurs spread. Coenus, one of his trusted generals, spoke openly. He reminded Alexander that men longed to see their families again, to enjoy the wealth they had won. They had followed him to the ends of the earth, but now they would go no further. It was not mutiny in rage, but resistance born of fatigue. Alexander raged. He withdrew to his tent, refusing food, waiting for soldiers to relent. Days passed, yet their resolve held firm. Even the companions, once eager for every charge, stood united. At last, Alexander yielded. He performed sacrifices, asking the gods for signs. When omens suggested it was not destined to continue east, he announced the march would turn back. The army rejoiced. The decision at the Hyphasis marked a profound moment. For years, Alexander's will had bent the world. At Granicus, Issus, Gaugamela, and Hydaspes, he had faced larger foes and triumphed. But here, on the banks of a river in India, he confronted the one force he could not conquer, the exhaustion of his own men. No sarissa could pierce fatigue. No cavalry charge could outflank longing for home. Turning back was not surrender. It was recognition of human limits. Yet Alexander felt bitterness. He believed destiny called him to rule all the world, but his soldiers' refusal set boundaries. Still he adapted. He resolved to explore the rivers of India, to map coastlines, and to return west with new knowledge as well as conquest. Even in disappointment, ambition reshaped itself into fresh goals. The Hyphasis thus became more than a river. It was a symbol. For Alexander, it was the edge of his dream. For his army, it was proof that even kings must bow to mortal endurance. From this point forward, the campaign would turn not toward greater conquest, but toward the long road home. That journey would test the army in ways even battle could not. When Alexander turned back from the Hyphasis, he refused to let retreat feel like defeat. Instead, he recast the march as exploration, a journey to chart the rivers of India and link conquest with discovery. The army followed the Hydaspes downstream, then the Assassines, and finally the Indus. The journey south would last 10 months, filled with hardship and peril, yet also new triumphs and near disaster. In the Punjab, tribes resisted. The fiercest were the Malians, whose fortified cities defied Macedonian assaults. At one stronghold, Alexander personally led the attack. Scaling ladders under a hail of arrows, he reached the walls, first leaping inside, with only a handful of companions. For a moment, the king stood isolated, surrounded by enemies. He fought desperately until an arrow pierced his chest. Accounts say the shaft lodged deep blood, flooding his lungs. Soldiers carried him away, convinced their king was dying. Panic spread. For days, Alexander lay near death. Surgeons cut into his chest, removing the arrowhead. Rumors swept the camp that he had fallen. To restore morale, Alexander ordered himself carried outside. Pale, weak, yet alive, he showed his men he still breathed. The sight restored loyalty and inspired renewed effort. Though scarred, he refused to let the wound define him. His survival became another piece of legend, proof to many that gods still protected him. As the army pressed south, Alexander ordered a fleet constructed. He appointed Nercus, a trusted admiral, to lead a naval expedition along the coast. Ships sailed from the Indus to the Arabian Sea through waters unknown to Greeks. The voyage, lasting months, mapped new lands and revealed trade routes that would later link east and west. It was one of antiquity's great voyages, expanding knowledge as much as empire. Meanwhile, Alexander led the land force west through Gadrosia, today's Makran Desert in Pakistan. The decision proved catastrophic. Heat scorched the land, water vanished, and sand stretched without end. Men collapsed by the hundreds, animals died of thirst and supply, caravans disappeared into dunes. Ancient sources claim more soldiers perished in Gadrosia than in any of Alexander's battles. The desert march became a nightmare, a grim reminder that nature could inflict heavier losses than any enemy. Yet the army endured. Ragged, starved, and scarred survivors staggered into Carmania months later. Alexander staged a triumphal procession, complete with music feasts and drinking, as if to mask suffering with spectacle. To his men, the contrast was stark. Endless sacrifice, followed by the king's relentless display of glory. Some cheered, others grew silent, their loyalty tempered by fatigue. By the time the army rejoined Nerkes and the fleet near the Persian Gulf, Alexander had achieved more than conquest. He had marched through lands unknown to Greeks, survived wounds that nearly killed him, and endured deserts that devoured armies. He had fused war with exploration, expanding maps as much as frontiers. But the cost was staggering. His men carried memories of comrades buried in sand rivers and jungles. Glory now mingled with grief. The return from India marked a shift. Alexander had reached the limits of geography and human endurance. Ahead lay Babylon Susa and the core of his empire. There, instead of rivers and deserts, he would confront politics, resentment, and the challenges of ruling what he had conquered. The campaign of expansion was ending. The struggle to govern was about to begin. When Alexander returned from India in 324 BC, he re-entered Persia not as a conqueror, but as master of an empire stretched from Greece to the Indus. Yet the long absence had exposed corruption. Many satraps left in charge while he campaigned had ruled harshly, extorting taxes, plundering temples, and abusing local populations. Reports of injustice angered Alexander. He ordered investigations. Several governors were executed, others stripped of office. To Persians it signaled he would not tolerate misrule. To Macedonians it showed that even old allies could fall if loyalty faltered. In Susa, Alexander staged one of his most ambitious political acts. To fuse Macedonian and Persian elites, he organized a mass marriage ceremony. 80 of his officers wed noble Persian women. Alexander himself married to Statira, daughter of Darius, and Parysatis, daughter of the previous king Artaxerxes. Roxana, his Bactrian wife, remained at his side, but now joined a court transformed into a symbol of cultural fusion. For Alexander, these unions embodied his vision of a single empire where East and West merged. The weddings dazzled with feasts, music, and lavish gifts, yet beneath celebration simmered unease. Macedonian soldiers grumbled that their king, now dressed in Persian robes, performed Persian rituals and preferred Persian courtiers. The blending of traditions felt less like unity and more like betrayal of Greek identity. Still, Alexander pressed forward, convinced that greatness lay in fusion, not division. Soon after, he sought to integrate his army as well. 30,000 young Persians were trained in Macedonian drill, learning the sarissa and phalanx tactics. Alexander presented them as future companion soldiers who would fight alongside veterans. To his mind, it was pragmatic new recruits for a vast empire. To Macedonian troops, it was threatening. They feared being replaced, their hard-won prestige eroded by foreigners. The tension erupted at Opis near the Tigris. When Alexander announced plans to send older Macedonian veterans, home soldiers mutinied. They accused him of favoring Persians and abandoning men who had carried him to victory. Shouts filled the camp, anger turning against the king himself. For the first time, Alexander faced not distant rebels, but his own army's rage. He responded with fury. He arrested ringleaders and had them executed before the troops. Then he delivered a speech, reminding soldiers of their shared journey from humble Macedonia. They had crossed Asia, defeated Persia, and stood as rulers of the world. He listed battles, wounds, and triumphs, pointing to his own scars as proof he had shared their hardships. His voice cracked with emotion. Silence replaced anger. Men wept, reconciling with their king. They begged forgiveness, and Alexander accepted sealing loyalty once more. Yet the episode revealed cracks. The soldiers had followed him across deserts and rivers, but their patience was finite. His dream of merging cultures though visionary, strained the very men who secured it. The rebellion at Opis showed the limits of even a king's charisma. Still, Alexander pressed ahead with his vision. He appointed Persians to high office, encouraged intermarriage, and planned new campaigns into Arabia. In his mind, the empire was not static, but ever expanding, a living organism that demanded constant growth. For his followers, the dream was exhilarating but exhausting. The transformation was complete. Alexander had begun as Macedonian prince, champion of Greek revenge against Persia. Now he stood as king of kings, heir of Darius, pharaoh of Egypt, lord of lands stretching beyond imagination. His ambition reached beyond borders, beyond traditions, into the realm of myth. Yet beneath the grandeur, soldiers whispered, how long could even Alexander defy the limits of men and empire? In the autumn of 324 BC, tragedy struck Alexander more deeply than any wound from battle. At Ecbatana, his closest companion Hephaestion fell ill with fever. Some accounts suggest typhoid, others food poisoning, but the result was the same. After days of weakness, Hephaestion died. For Alexander, it was like losing a second self. Their bond had begun in childhood, grown through campaigns, and endured across continents. Now, suddenly, it ended. The king's grief was overwhelming. He lay beside the body, refusing food or comfort. He cut his hair short, echoing Achilles' mourning Patroclus. He ordered massive funerary rites. Throughout the empire, sacrifices were made, music silenced, and mourning decreed. Temples were stripped of their roofs, horses' manes shorn, and thousands of troops compelled to grieve with their king. Hephaestion was declared divine hero, a status few mortals ever receive. In Babylon, Alexander planned a grand pyre, a monument of staggering cost, some say over 10,000 talents of silver. This grief revealed both Alexander's humanity and his growing sense of divinity. He saw Hephaestion not as mere friend, but as partner in destiny. To lose him was more than personal tragedy. It was rupture in cosmic order. The king's actions blurred line between mourning and worship, turning grief into political theatre, binding the empire in sorrow shared with its ruler. Yet Alexander did not retreat into despair alone. Within months, he launched one final campaign. In the winter of 324-323 BC, he marched against the Kosaye fierce mountain tribes in the Zagros. These raiders had plagued empires for generations, defying even Persian kings. Alexander led his troops through narrow valleys, storming villages, crushing resistance. The campaign lasted only weeks, but ended with submission. For his soldiers, it was another demonstration that their king remained invincible even in grief. Still, change was evident. The once restless conqueror who had raced eastward now lingered in Babylon, planning instead of charging. Yet his plans were vast. He envisioned conquest of Arabia, voyages into the Persian Gulf, and exploration of lands beyond. Some sources claim he dreamed even of Carthage and the western Mediterranean. To Alexander, the world had no end. His maps stretched limitlessly, his imagination leaping from sea to sea. But signs of fragility grew. The empire strained under distant cultures and rivalries. Veterans longed for rest. Satraps conspired, courtiers whispered. Even Alexander's body, hardened by years of war, carried scars and exhaustion. Though only 31, he had lived with relentless pace. Nights of feasting and drinking mingled with days of battle and planning. The arrow wound in India, the heat of Gedrosia, the grief for Hephaestion all weighed heavily. In Babylon, embassies arrived from distant peoples, Libyans, Etruscans, Scythians, even envoys from India. To them, Alexander was not just a king, but a figure larger than life, a living myth. They offered recognition gifts and alliances. Yet, as the world acknowledged his supremacy, his inner circle saw a man frayed by loss, his ambitions undimmed, but his humanity pierced by sorrow. The death of Hephaestion marks the beginning of Alexander's own decline. He continued to plan, to dream, to act as though immortal, but for the first time, cracks showed. Grief had hollowed him, and though he hid it behind campaigns and ceremonies, those close to him sensed destiny was closing in. In the spring of 323 BC, Alexander established his court in Babylon, the ancient city on the Euphrates. It had once been capital of Nebuchadnezzar, and now it served as the center of an empire stretching from Greece to India. Here, Alexander planned his next campaigns. Arabia would be first. Scouts had reported fertile coasts, harbors, and wealth in incense and trade. Shipyards filled with timber fleets were prepared, supplies gathered. Even after 10 years of war, Alexander saw no end, only horizons waiting to be crossed. At Babylon, embassies arrived from across the world. Ethiopians, Libyans, Scythians, Italians, and distant tribes sent envoys. They brought gifts and pledges acknowledging his supremacy. To many, Alexander was more than a man. He was a figure of myth, a new Heracles, a living god. Yet within his court tension simmered. Old comrades whispered of excess. Drinking feasts grew longer ambitions, greater patience, thinner. Then, during a banquet in late May, Alexander fell ill. He had drunk heavily as was custom, but this sickness lingered. Fever gripped him, his strength faltered. Some said it was malaria, others typhoid, still others poison. Ancient writers disagree, and mystery remains. For 11 days he weakened, unable to rise from bed. Yet even in illness he spoke of future campaigns, dictating orders for Arabia, planning new conquests. His generals watched anxiously. Without him, the empire was a shell. Unity depended not on laws or institutions, but on his presence. As fever worsened, soldiers demanded to see him. They filed past his bed, thousands strong, silent except for tears. Alexander, barely able to speak, raised his hand in recognition. It was the last time his men saw him alive. On June 10323 BC, Alexander the Great died in Babylon. He was 32 years old. He had reigned 12 years, conquered the Persian Empire, marched farther than any Greek before him, and left behind a realm that stretched from the Aegean Sea to the Indus River. He died undefeated in battle, yet undone by forces unseen. His death unleashed chaos. Alexander left no clear heir. Roxana was pregnant, but her child not yet born. His half-brother Aridaeus suffered from disability. Generals debated, quarreled, and schemed. The empire, vast and rich, could not remain whole. It had been held together only by his charisma, his vision, his relentless energy. Without him, fissures widened. For his soldiers, grief mixed with fear. They had marched under a man who seemed touched by the divine. Now he was gone, leaving questions without answers. Was he poisoned by rivals? Was his body weakened by years of wounds, feasts, and exhaustion? Or had gods claimed him, refusing to let a mortal hold such power too long? Theories multiplied, but certainty never came. In Babylon, plans for his burial faltered. His golden sarcophagus, destined for Macedonia, was hijacked and diverted to Egypt. There in Alexandria, his body was displayed for centuries, a relic of living legend. Today its location remains unknown, one of history's enduring mysteries. The death of Alexander ended one chapter, but began another. His generals, the Diadochi, would carve the empire into kingdoms, waging decades of war. From their struggles rose new powers, the Seleucid Empire, the Ptolemies of Egypt, the Antigonids of Macedonia. His legacy lived in their ambitions, in cities bearing his name, and in the spread of Greek language and ideas across Asia. Yet for those who had followed him, the loss was personal. Their king, who had led them across rivers, deserts, and mountains, who had stood invincible in battle, was gone. The death of Alexander left the empire without direction. He had no adult heir, no clear successor, and no system strong enough to hold together territories spanning from Greece to India. Power fell into the hands of his generals. Men who had marched beside him, fought his battles, and now sought to claim pieces of his legacy. They became known as the Diadochi, the successors. At first they tried compromise. Alexander's half-brother Philip Aridaeus, mentally impaired, but of royal blood, was proclaimed king alongside the unborn son of Roxana, Alexander's Bactrian queen. When the child was born, he was named Alexander IV. For a moment it seemed unity might survive under regency, but ambition quickly unraveled consensus. Generals maneuvered, armies clashed, alliances shifted like sand. Ptolemy, one of Alexander's trusted commanders, seized Egypt. He diverted the golden sarcophagus of Alexander himself, hijacking the funeral procession. Instead of Macedonia, the body rested in Alexandria, the city Alexander had founded. There, it became a symbol of legitimacy. Whoever controlled the tomb controlled a piece of the conqueror's aura. Seleucus, another general, gained control of Babylon and the eastern provinces. Antigonus Monophthalmus, the one-eyed, sought dominance over Asia Minor. Cassander, son of a Macedonian noble, took power in Greece and Macedonia. Each man claimed loyalty to Alexander's heirs, but, in reality, each carved his own kingdom. The heirs themselves met tragic ends. Roxana, once Alexander's queen, saw threats everywhere. She ordered the murder of Statira, daughter of Darius and Alexander's other wife, to eliminate rivals. Yet her own safety did not last. Years later, Cassander, consolidating his rule in Macedonia, had Roxana and young Alexander IV executed. The bloodline of Alexander was extinguished. Wars of the successors raged for decades. Battles spanned from Asia Minor to Egypt, from Greece to Mesopotamia. Armies that once marched together now slaughtered each other, using tactics Alexander had taught them. Cities changed hands repeatedly, and civilians bore the cost of endless struggle. By the early 3rd century BC, the empire had shattered into several Hellenistic kingdoms. Yet even in chaos, Alexander's influence endured. Greek language spread across the Near East, becoming the common tongue of trade, science, and administration. Philosophers debated in cities he founded. Sculptors blended Greek form with Eastern motifs, creating art both classical and exotic. Temples honored gods fused from Greek and local traditions. The Hellenistic world was born, an age of cultural synthesis that lasted centuries. Still, questions lingered. What if Alexander had lived longer? Would he have conquered Arabia, the Western Mediterranean, even Rome? Would the empire have remained whole under his vision? History offered no answers, only fragments. The reality was that no one but Alexander had the charisma, audacity, and genius to hold such vast lands. His generals inherited his armies, but not his unifying spirit. The wars of the successors proved that Alexander's empire was both immense and fragile. In life, his energy bound it together. In death, ambition tore it apart. Yet through this fracture, Greek culture spread farther than any single king could have planned. In that paradox collapse giving birth to diffusion lay the true legacy of Alexander. Out of the chaos of Alexander's death and the wars of his successors, a new age began the Hellenistic world. It was not a single empire, but a mosaic of kingdoms shaped by generals who had once marched beneath the same banner. Each carved territory for himself, yet all carried forward the imprint of their former king. In Egypt, Ptolemy secured power and built a dynasty that would last nearly 3 centuries. His capital, Alexandria, became more than a city. It grew into the greatest hub of knowledge in the ancient world. The Library of Alexandria, filled with scrolls gathered from across lands, preserved science, philosophy, and literature. Scholars measured the circumference of Earth, studied stars, and dissected human bodies. Greek thinkers in Egypt blended their ideas with traditions of the Nile, Babylon, and beyond. Seleucus controlled the vast east from Mesopotamia to Persia. His Seleucid Empire extended Greek influence deep into Asia, planting new cities, spreading Greek language and art. Yet in these lands, Greek ways mingled with older cultures. Temples combined Greek columns with Eastern carvings. Gods received new names, and trade connected Greece with India. Coins bore images of kings with both Greek and Persian symbols, declaring fusion rather than division. In Macedonia and Greece, Cassander ruled while Antigonus and his descendants fought for dominance over Asia Minor. The result was constant warfare, but also innovation. Armies of the Hellenistic kingdoms grew larger, their siege engines more complex, their tactics evolving from what Alexander had pioneered. The art of war became as much about machines as men, as catapults and towers reached unprecedented scale. Yet beyond politics, what truly defined the Hellenistic world was cultural blending. Greek became the language of trade, from the Mediterranean to the Hindu Kush. Merchants carried amphorae of wine and olive oil east, while spices, ivory, and silk flowed west. Sculptors carved statues with Greek precision, but dressed their subjects in Eastern robes. Philosophers debated not only Plato and Aristotle, but also wisdom drawn from Persia and India. At Alexandria, the museum and library drew scholars like bees to honey. Eratosthenes calculated Earth's circumference with remarkable accuracy. Euclid wrote, "Elements, the foundation of geometry still taught today." Astronomers mapped constellations, doctors recorded treatments, engineers designed machines. Knowledge once scattered across empires concentrated in one place, turning Alexandria into the brain of the Hellenistic world. Religion also shifted. Greek gods traveled east, mingling with local deities. Zeus fused with Egyptian Amun. Eastern gods adopted Greek forms, their statues carved with flowing robes. In this fusion, people found ways to bridge cultures. To some it was enrichment, to others it was loss of old traditions. The Hellenistic world was both expansion and erosion, creation and destruction intertwined. Even daily life reflected this blend. In markets of Antioch, merchants sold olives beside Persian rugs. In Alexandria, Greeks debated philosophy, while Egyptian priests performed ancient rituals nearby. Soldiers from Macedonia married women from Bactria and Persia, their children growing up speaking two languages, carrying mixed traditions. It was a world less about pure identities than about exchange. The legacy of Alexander survived not in his heirs murdered and forgotten, but in this diffusion. He had dreamed of uniting East and West, and though his empire fractured, the cultural fusion endured. For centuries, until Rome rose in the West and Parthia in the East, the Hellenistic kingdoms shaped art, science, and trade. They stood as proof that conquest can shatter and create, leaving behind worlds that rulers never fully control. The legacy of Alexander shone with brilliance, but it also cast deep shadows. His empire was built not only with vision, but with blood. For every city founded, another was burned. For every culture honored, another was enslaved. To admire his genius is to also confront the devastation he left behind. At Persepolis, Alexander's men looted palaces filled with centuries of wealth. Gold and silver ornaments were stripped, statues toppled, and sacred halls burned. Some sources claim he acted in drunken celebration, others that he sought revenge for Athens's temples, destroyed in 480 BC. Either way, an ancient capital was reduced to ruins. To Persians, this was not liberation, but humiliation. The fire became a symbol of conquest at its most ruthless. In Tyre, after 7 months of resistance, 2,000 defenders were crucified along the shore. Women and children were sold into slavery. At Gaza, after stubborn resistance, the commander Batis was dragged behind a chariot echoing Achilles and Hector. These were not isolated acts of rage, but demonstrations of terror meant to break will and prevent rebellion. For locals, they proved submission meant survival. Resistance meant annihilation. The conquered bore heavy burdens. Tribute poured from provinces to pay armies, build fleets, and fund spectacles. Farmers in Asia and Persia carried heavier taxes to sustain distant campaigns. Villages uprooted populations, relocated thousands enslaved. To Macedonian veterans, victory brought loot and estates. To subject peoples, it brought chains. Even Alexander's own men grew weary. After years of hardship, they longed for Macedon, for families left behind. Yet, their king's ambition seemed boundless. When he ordered them further into India, they mutinied at the Hyphasis. No threat, no speech, no divine aura could bend their exhaustion. For the first time they forced him to yield. That moment revealed the cost of endless conquest. Even loyalty has limits. The shadow also touched his companions. Clitus, who saved Alexander at Granicus, died by the king's own hand, in a drunken quarrel. Parmenian veteran of decades was murdered on suspicion after his son's alleged conspiracy. Callisthenes, historian and relative of Aristotle, was imprisoned and left to die after criticizing court rituals. The king who once fought beside equals now ruled with paranoia. Greatness had narrowed into suspicion. For ordinary soldiers, memory was conflicted. They had seen Babylon's splendor, Egypt's temples, India's elephants. They had won battles against impossible odds, carried sarissas across deserts, and built cities in foreign lands. But they had also buried countless comrades, suffered hunger in Gedrosia, and watched a king become distant, more Persian than Macedonian. For some, Alexander was still Achilles reborn. For others, he was tyrant cloaked in divinity. So what was the true cost of greatness? Was it measured in temples, destroyed cities, enslaved, and rivers of blood? Or in knowledge spread cultures fused and horizons expanded? The paradox cannot be resolved. Alexander's brilliance cannot be separated from his brutality. The empire he left behind was both triumph of ambition and testament to destruction. History remembers him as the Great. Yet for many who lived in the shadow of his conquests, greatness was indistinguishable from grief. By the time Alexander died, he was more than a Macedonian king. To some, he was a god in human form, conqueror of worlds, embodiment of destiny. To others, he was destroyer, tyrant, and foreign oppressor. The dual image began in antiquity and has never disappeared. Greek sources like Arrian, writing centuries later, painted Alexander as heroic, disciplined, a general of unmatched genius. They emphasized his courage at Granicus, his strategy at Issus, his brilliance at Gaugamela. Arrian drew heavily on Ptolemy and Aristobulus. Men who served Alexander so admiration colored every page. In this version, Alexander was a new Achilles, chosen by fate to carry Greek civilization eastward. Other writers offered darker portraits. Curtius Rufus, writing under Rome, highlighted arrogance, cruelty, and suspicion. He described the murder of Clitus, the burning of Persepolis, the paranoia that consumed his court. To him, Alexander was warning, as much as inspiration, proof of how ambition can corrupt even greatness. Persian memory was harsher still. For many, Alexander was not the great, but the accursed. They remembered Persepolis in flames, satraps executed, and centuries of empire shattered. He was invader, not liberator, the man who ended Achaemenid glory. In India, memories mixed. Some saw him as foreign conqueror who brought blood and fire. Others remembered alliances with rulers like Taxiles, or respected his treatment of Porus after Hydaspes. In these stories, he was both destroyer and patron, a man whose shadow stretched long after departure. Modern historians wrestle with contradictions. His campaigns revealed tactical brilliance using terrain timing and audacity to defeat larger forces. His political vision sought to fuse East and West, not merely plunder them. Yet evidence also shows his brutality: crucifixions at Tyre, massacres of mercenaries, enslavement of whole cities. The record is fragmented, biased, and often contradictory. Each ancient author shaped Alexander to fit their own age. What remains undeniable are numbers. He reigned only 12 years, yet created an empire stretching over 2 million square miles. He founded more than 20 cities, many still inhabited today. His armies marched over 20,000 miles from Greece to India before he was 33. No general in antiquity equaled such pace. These facts anchor the legend. But numbers cannot capture cost. For every city founded, others were razed. For every soldier who returned rich, others lay in graves far from home. For every cultural exchange, there was forced assimilation. The Hellenistic world was both creation and destruction, progress and trauma. So who was Alexander Hero, tyrant, visionary, destroyer, perhaps all at once? He was not simply Greek, Persian, or Egyptian, but a fusion of all. His ambition created possibilities, but his methods left scars. History often prefers neat categories: conqueror or liberator, genius or madman. Alexander resists them all. What lingers is the paradox. His empire collapsed quickly, yet his cultural legacy endured for centuries. He died young, yet his image shaped kings, emperors, and generals for millennia. He sought eternity, and in a way, he achieved it. The cities founded by Alexander, and later expanded by his successors, became the beating heart of the Hellenistic world. Among them, none shone brighter than Alexandria in Egypt. Perched on the Mediterranean coast, it grew rapidly into a metropolis of trade, culture, and science. Ships from Greece, Phoenicia, and Arabia crowded its harbors. Merchants unloaded olive oil, wine, papyrus, ivory, incense, and grain. The city was designed on a grid, with wide avenues, theaters, temples, and a royal quarter overlooking the sea. At its core stood the great library of Alexandria, a wonder of the ancient world. Ptolemaic kings gathered scrolls from every land. Ships docking in Alexandria had their texts seized, copied, and stored. Within its halls, thousands of works from Greece, Mesopotamia, Egypt, and India were preserved. Knowledge flowed across borders. Euclid wrote, "Elements the foundation of geometry." Eratosthenes measured Earth's circumference with remarkable precision within a few hundred miles of modern calculations. Astronomers charted stars. Doctors dissected bodies. Poets composed verses, blending Greek and Egyptian imagery. Markets of Alexandria echoed with dozens of languages. Greek became lingua franca, but traders spoke Aramaic, Egyptian, Persian, even early Sanskrit. The city's population mixed Greeks, Jews, Egyptians, Syrians, and Africans. Neighborhoods buzzed with argument, laughter, and trade. It was a place where cultures collided and combined. A Greek merchant could buy incense from Arabia, consult an Egyptian priest, and dine on spices carried from India, all in a single day. Nor was Alexandria unique. Antioch in Syria flourished as another hub of exchange. Pergamon in Asia Minor became a rival center of learning, boasting its own library with hundreds of thousands of scrolls. Seleucia on the Tigris linked Mediterranean trade with Persia. These cities embodied Alexander's unintended legacy. Though his empire collapsed, the network of Hellenistic cities bound east and west more tightly than before. Art reflected this blending. Sculptors carved gods with Greek anatomy but Eastern dress. Statues of rulers bore diadems like Persian kings, yet posed with Greek heroic style. Temples rose with columns and friezes, but altars honored gods merged from different traditions. Zeus fused with Ammon, Aphrodite, with Ishtar. This hybrid religion gave diverse populations a sense of belonging within the new world. Daily life, too, revealed fusion. Macedonian veterans married local women, their children raised in bilingual households. Schools taught Homer alongside Babylonian astronomy. Markets sold both Greek olive oil and Mesopotamian textiles. Banquets mixed Greek wine with Eastern spices. To walk through a Hellenistic city was to feel the pulse of two worlds becoming one. The wealth of these cities rested on trade. Grain from Egypt fed growing populations. Spices from India flavored Greek kitchens. Silk from China traveled through Central Asia, reaching Mediterranean markets for the first time. In return, Greek art, philosophy, and architecture spread eastward. Roads and harbors linked regions once distant. For centuries, this web of commerce and culture endured, shaping societies long after Alexander's name faded. Yet, beneath the prosperity lay inequality. Greek elites often held higher status, ruling councils and commanding armies. Local populations provided labor taxes and tribute. The blend was not always equal exchange, but hierarchy masked by cultural fusion. Still, the Hellenistic city offered opportunity and cosmopolitan life, unknown to earlier ages. In Alexandria, under the shadow of its lighthouse, the Pharos, one of the seven wonders' sailors, scholars, and storytellers, mingled. It was the world Alexander imagined, but never lived to see, a place where East and West no longer met in battle, but in markets, libraries, and streets, alive with every tongue of the known world. The Hellenistic world thrived not only on culture, but also on commerce. Alexander's conquests had stitched together regions once separated by deserts, mountains, and empires. Roads, ports, and cities formed new arteries for trade. Wealth flowed on a scale the Mediterranean had never seen. Yet that wealth was unevenly shared, feeding grandeur for elites, while peasants and laborers bore the weight. Egypt became the economic engine. Under the Ptolemies, grain from the Nile fed not only Alexandria, but also cities across the Mediterranean. Taxes collected from farmers filled royal treasuries. Grain exports alone enriched Egypt, making its kings among the wealthiest rulers of antiquity. Merchants prospered, but peasants worked under strict control, their harvests carefully measured and taxed. Silver and coinage standardized exchange. Alexander had melted down treasures from Susa and Persepolis, releasing thousands of talents of silver into circulation. His successors minted coins stamped with Greek gods, or their own portraits, spreading uniform currency across continents. A trader in Antioch could recognize the same symbols as a merchant in Bactria. This monetary unity helped commerce flourish. Trade routes stretched farther than ever. From ports in Egypt and Syria, ships sailed to Arabia and India. Spices, ivory, pearls, and cotton flowed westward. In return, Greek wine, olive oil, and metalwork traveled east. Caravans crossed Central Asia, bringing silk from China, though still rare and precious. For the first time, the Mediterranean economy connected with distant Asia in lasting networks. Markets in Hellenistic cities bustled with goods from every horizon. In Alexandria, merchants sold cinnamon from India, papyrus from the Nile, glassware from Phoenicia, and rugs from Persia. In Seleucia, on the Tigris, caravans brought horses, gems, and spices. In Bactria, coins stamped with Greek rulers circulated beside local traditions, proof of economic blending. But prosperity had sharp edges. Royal courts displayed wealth through lavish palaces, festivals, and monuments. Ptolemies spent fortunes on temples and libraries. Seleucids funded giant cities. Yet beneath, splendor lay inequality. Farmers often lived at subsistence level, their labor extracted through taxes. Slavery remained foundation of agriculture and household wealth. For every scholar in Alexandria, thousands of workers toiled unseen. Class divisions hardened. Greek settlers and their descendants often held privileged status, forming urban elites. Local populations filled lower ranks, taxed heavily, and excluded from power. Resentment sometimes boiled into revolts, crushed by armies trained in Macedonian style. The economic system, though vibrant, remained unequal, serving rulers and merchants more than common people. The question lingers: what did Alexander intend? Did he dream of a unified empire of equals, or was he building markets for elites to exploit? Ancient sources give little clarity. His marriages and policies suggested fusion, yet his methods often imposed hierarchy. Perhaps his vision was too grand for one lifetime, leaving successors to shape it for their own benefit. What is certain is that the Hellenistic economy linked worlds as never before. Goods, money, and ideas crossed continents. This web of trade laid foundations for later empires from Rome to Byzantium that inherited the routes Alexander's armies first blazed. It was both legacy and irony. Soldiers had marched for glory, but merchants reaped the longer-lasting rewards. Power is never just taken with armies. It is sustained with images. Alexander understood this well. From the beginning of his campaign, he crafted a public face that turned conquest into destiny. Coins struck in his name showed him with the horns of Ammon, linking him to the Egyptian god. In others, he appeared as Heracles wearing the lion's skin, a reminder that he was descendant of Zeus. These symbols traveled farther than his armies. A coin passed from Macedonian soldier to Persian merchant carried not only silver, but the image of a king who claimed divine favor. The message was clear: Alexander was not only ruler, but chosen by gods. This was more than vanity. In an empire that stretched across dozens of cultures, symbols mattered more than words. A Persian might not know Greek, but he recognized divine horns or heroic lion's skin. A coin in his hand told him who now commanded Asia. Art and monuments reinforced the image. Sculptors carved statues of Alexander with upward gaze, lips parted slightly hair, flowing as if caught by divine wind. This style became iconic. Later, kings imitated it, adopting the Alexander look to project authority. It was not portrait, but ideal, showing him as eternally young, strong, and touched by heaven. In contrast, his soldiers saw a man scarred, weary, sometimes drunk, sometimes grieving. Propaganda smoothed the rough edges into myth. After his death, successors used the image for themselves. Ptolemy in Egypt kept Alexander's body, displaying it in Alexandria as proof of legitimacy. Seleucid kings minted coins, showing Alexander as Heracles, but with their own names stamped alongside. Antigonid rulers in Macedonia posed in statues with the same tilted gaze. They borrowed his face to borrow his aura. But was Alexander himself truly divine? Ancient sources disagree. Some claim he believed himself son of Zeus Ammon. Others say he accepted titles out of necessity, knowing Persians expected their kings to be more than mortal. At Siwa, priests hailed him as God's son, but whether he believed or played along remains debated. What is certain is that the line between human and divine blurred, and Alexander never sought to correct it. Propaganda also shaped memory of battles. At Issus mosaics later depicted Alexander charging at Darius, eyes fierce spear aimed straight at the Persian king. In reality, the battlefield was chaos, filled with thousands of men. But the image of one man facing another reduced complexity to legend Alexander, the fearless Darius the fleeing. It was history rewritten as theatre, and it endured longer than truth. The question remains, did Alexander control propaganda? Or did propaganda create Alexander without coins, statues, and legends? Would he have remained simply a brilliant general, soon forgotten? Or did his genius include not only tactics on battlefield, but also in imagination, ensuring he lived in memory as larger than life? Either way, the manipulation of image became central to Hellenistic rule. Kings who followed him built theatres, temples, and libraries, not only for culture, but to remind subjects of divine favour. They knew power rested as much on marble and myth as on spears. Alexander had shown them the way. History often records the deeds of kings and generals, but rarely the voices of common people. In Alexander's empire, millions lived unseen. In chronicles, their lives shaped by decisions made far above them. What did they think as armies marched through their fields, as new cities rose, as taxes were levied in names foreign to their tongue? For farmers in Persia, conquest meant little change at first. They still planted barley-tended orchards and paid tribute. But the coins they handed over bore a new face, the name of Alexander or his successors. Taxes sometimes increased, especially when campaigns demanded fresh supplies. Soldiers quartered in villages, ate their stores, drank their wine, and moved on. The glory celebrated in marble halls translated into hunger for families in mud homes. In Phoenician ports like Tyre or Sidon, life was harsher. Resistance meant slaughter or slavery. Survivors saw their neighbors crucified, their children sold. For them, Alexander was not liberator, but terror. In Egypt, peasants offered grain as they had under pharaohs and Persians alike. Yet they noticed Greek officials speaking strange language and temples rebuilt not for Amun alone, but for Zeus Ammon, a fusion alien and familiar. In India, villagers saw elephants seized fields, trampled, and cities besieged. The siege of Massaga ended with massacre its people enslaved. To Macedonian veterans, it was another victory. To locals, it was trauma that echoed for generations. But sources written by conquerors seldom preserved these voices. Their silence is louder than any speech. Even within Alexander's own ranks, ordinary soldiers carried burdens untold by official histories. They marched 20,000 miles, slept under desert stars, and buried comrades far from home. Pay often came late loot unevenly distributed. Veterans longed for Macedonia for wives and children unseen in nearly a decade. Their complaints surfaced only when mutiny erupted at the Hyphasis or Opis. For most of the journey, they endured quietly, bound by discipline and fear of punishment. Slaves made the empire function. Captured in wars, they worked fields, carried supplies, and built cities. Their voices are lost entirely. For them, Alexander's victories meant chains, not glory. In the bustling streets of Alexandria or Seleucia, slaves labored unseen while scholars debated and kings feasted. Their silence is testament to inequality at the empire's heart. Yet life was not only suffering. Some found opportunity. Merchants thrived as trade routes opened. Craftsmen in Alexandria sold pottery, jewelry, and glass to markets once unreachable. Soldiers settled in new cities, marrying local women, raising children who spoke 2 languages. Cultural blending brought new foods, new gods, and new stories. For some, the Hellenistic age was not oppression, but chance to live in a larger, more connected world. The truth lay in contradiction. For every peasant burdened by taxes, another merchant grew rich. For every city burned, another flourished with theatres and libraries. For every soldier lost in Gedrosia, another found land in Bactria. Alexander's empire created winners and losers, just as every empire does. But history remembers the king, not the farmer, not the slave. Their voices vanish between lines of chronicles, leaving us to imagine daily lives under shadow of conquest. Perhaps the greatest silence of Alexander's empire is not what was recorded, but what was never written. The laughter of children in villages, the tears of widows, the mutters of soldiers dreaming of home. Most of what we know about Alexander comes from Greek and Roman writers, but his image looked very different in the lands he conquered. In Persia, memory of him endured not as the great, but as the accursed. For Persians, he was the man who looted Persepolis, desecrated temples, and ended the dynasty of Darius. Later Persian chronicles, written centuries afterward, still called him a destroyer. To them, Alexander was not a liberator, but a calamity that ended an age of order. Indian sources offer a mixed view. In the Sanskrit epic traditions, Alexander appears briefly as a foreign invader, whose presence was disruptive, but not defining. Local kings like Porus loomed larger in memory, remembered for their resistance and dignity. The story of Porus's reply to Alexander, "Treat me like a king," was cherished in Indian narratives as proof of native honor, not Macedonian triumph. For Indian historians, Alexander was a storm that passed, not a new foundation. Egyptian memory was more complex. Many Egyptians welcomed him initially as a liberator from Persian rule. Priests crowned him pharaoh at Memphis. At Siwa, they declared him son of Amun. For a time, Alexander seemed to respect Egyptian traditions. Yet later, under the Ptolemies, Egyptians saw that power remained in Greek hands. Alexander became symbol of transition, not salvation. His name survived in Alexandria, but his image faded beneath dynasties that ruled Egypt in his name, not for its people. Even among Greeks, interpretations varied. Some saw him as hero who avenged Marathon and Salamis by toppling Persia. Others whispered he was tyrant who destroyed Thebes and executed loyal companions. Philosophers debated whether his ambition was noble pursuit of excellence or hubris destined for ruin. Centuries later, Romans studied him as model of generalship, yet also as warning of excess. Julius Caesar wept at his statue, lamenting how little he had achieved by the same age. The gap between propaganda and memory was wide. Coins and statues showed Alexander as godlike figure gazing toward eternity. But local chronicles, oral traditions, and ruins told a harsher story. In Tyre, people remembered crucifixions. In Sogdia, families remembered slaughter. In India, villages remembered fire and chains. These voices, seldom written in Greek histories, shaped how conquered peoples saw him. The clash of perspectives raises a question: who owns history? Victors write chronicles, but vanquished preserve memory in silence, rituals, and stories. Alexander's propaganda made him immortal in the West, but in the East scars remained. To Persians he was no god, only a mortal who burned cities. To Indians he was no world ruler, only a brief shadow. To Egyptians he was both pharaoh and foreigner. This divergence shows the limits of conquest. Armies can seize land, but they cannot fully control memory. Each people interprets events through its own experience. Alexander may have claimed universal kingship, but his image fractured into many faces. Some worshipped him, others cursed him, and most simply endured his passing. History today tries to reconcile these contradictions. By reading both Greek chronicles and local traditions, we see a fuller picture. Alexander was not one thing, but many: hero, tyrant, liberator, invader, all depending on where one stood when his armies arrived. Ancient sources about Alexander are rich in detail, but poor in neutrality. They were written centuries later, often by men who admired or feared him, and shaped by agendas of their own times. How do we know which stories are true? Modern archaeology and material evidence provide clues, sometimes confirming the chronicles, sometimes exposing exaggeration. Take Persepolis. Greek writers claimed Alexander burned the palace in drunken revelry urged by courtesan ties. Others said it was deliberate revenge for Persian destruction of Athens. Excavations revealed charred remains of cedar beams and scorched floors, confirming the fire was real. But whether it was accident, vengeance, or spectacle remains debated. The stones tell us destruction happened, but not intention. At Tyre, ancient accounts describe 7 months of siege, a mole built into the sea, and crucifixions of 2,000 defenders. Archaeological surveys show remains of the mole still visible, now forming part of modern shoreline. This confirms Alexander's engineers indeed reshaped the coast. The scale of crucifixion may be exaggerated, but the brutality is consistent with evidence of mass burials nearby. The Gordian knot sliced dramatically by sword is harder to test. No physical trace survives, only legend repeated in sources. Did he truly cut it, or is it invention meant to symbolize decisiveness? Without material evidence, myth dominates, showing how history often preserves symbolism rather than fact. In India, accounts of Hydaspes speak of hundreds of elephants. Archaeology confirms Indian warfare used elephants widely, but numbers may have been inflated to heighten drama. Greek writers admired Porus's courage, but they also framed him as noble loser to magnify Alexander's mercy. Indian traditions remember Porus with pride, suggesting a story less about defeat than about resilience. Even Alexander's death is shrouded in uncertainty. Writers list fever, poison, and curses as causes. Archaeology can offer no proof, only speculation. The golden sarcophagus once in Alexandria vanished in antiquity. If ever rediscovered, forensic science might answer mysteries. For now, we rely on texts riddled with bias. Coins, however, speak clearly. Silver tetradrachs bearing Alexander's image circulated across Asia, discovered in hoards from Egypt to Afghanistan. They show his face with Heracles' lion's skin, or the horns of Ammon. These coins confirm propaganda's reach. Every marketplace, every transaction carried the king's divine claim. Unlike chronicles, coins are silent but honest. They prove what rulers wanted subjects to see. Archaeology also reveals daily life missing from texts. In Alexandria, fragments of papyrus show contracts, tax receipts, even love letters. They reveal farmers paying grain quotas, women managing estates, traders negotiating prices. These scraps of ordinary life balance the grand tales of conquest, reminding us empires were lived in kitchens and markets as much as on battlefields. The comparison between ancient sources and modern evidence teaches caution. Chronicles magnify Alexander into myth. Archaeology grounds him in reality: burnt beams, buried bones, stamped coins. The truth lies somewhere in between. He was not only legend, but also man, leaving material scars still visible today. So when we ask what Alexander truly was, we must weigh marble statues against ashes in Persepolis, heroic mosaics against footprints in desert sand. History is never just words. It is fragments, pieced together, always incomplete, always debated. The ripple effects of Alexander's conquests stretched far beyond the borders of his empire. Even regions he never reached felt the shockwaves of change. Ideas, goods, and armies crossed frontiers, leaving legacies that endured centuries after his death. In Mesopotamia, Greek became language of administration alongside Aramaic. Cities like Seleucia on the Tigris flourished as new capitals, blending Greek theatres with Mesopotamian temples. Astronomers of Babylon, long famed for tracking stars, exchanged knowledge with Greek mathematicians. Clay tablets recording eclipses sat beside papyrus scrolls of geometry. The two traditions, once separate, merged into a single scientific conversation. Persia, though conquered, did not vanish. Persian nobles retained offices as satraps under Alexander and his successors. Their administrative systems, tax records, road networks, royal couriers remained in use. But now they operated in tandem with Greek coinage and military garrisons. Persian culture influenced Greek settlers as much as Greek customs altered Persia. Festivals blended, marriages multiplied, and art fused styles. Reliefs carved in Greek fashion depicted Eastern robes and Eastern gods. In India, Alexander's brief incursion opened corridors that would later flourish under the Mauryan Empire. Chandragupta Maurya, founder of that dynasty, rose shortly after Alexander's departure. Some historians argue his rise was shaped by the vacuum Alexander left. Trade between India and the West expanded. Greek ambassadors sat at Mauryan courts, and Greek sculptors influenced stone carvings of Ashoka's pillars. Elephants marched in Greek armies, while Greek coins circulated in Punjab markets. Even beyond Central Asian steppes absorbed new ideas. The city of Ai-Khanum, founded later in Bactria, displayed Greek temples and theatres alongside Persian and local designs. In time, Hellenistic influence stretched into what is now Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, producing Greco-Bactrian kingdoms that minted coins with Greek deities on one side and Eastern symbols on the other. These hybrid states were born from Alexander's march, but carried lives of their own. Trade flourished along new routes. Spices from India reached Mediterranean tables. Horses from Central Asia powered Seleucid armies. Silk, still rare, travelled westward in small quantities, the first threads of what centuries later would become the Silk Road. Merchants grew wealthy caravanserais, dotted deserts, and cultural contacts deepened. The web of exchange owed its origin to Alexander's roads, cities, and vision of connection. Yet influence was not only economic. Religion absorbed the shock. In Egypt, Zeus fused with Amun. In Mesopotamia, local gods gained Greek names. In India, some scholars suggest Greek contact may have influenced early Buddhist art, shaping depictions of the Buddha in human form. In return, Greek philosophers encountered new ideas about the soul fate and cosmic order. These exchanges blurred lines between traditions, creating a world less insular, more global than before. For ordinary people, the ripple was felt in daily rhythms. Farmers in Mesopotamia sold grain not just to Persian satraps, but to Greek merchants. Craftsmen in Bactria carved idols with Greek helmets. Children in Alexandria learned Homer in one class and Egyptian myths in another. Soldiers from Macedon raised families in faraway lands, their descendants speaking two languages, worshipping gods with blended names. Alexander's empire collapsed quickly, but the connections it forged endured. The ripple effects spread like rings in water after a stone is thrown. They reached places Alexander never saw, shaping kingdoms and cultures that outlived him by centuries. In those ripples lay his truest legacy, not the empire itself, but the networks that bound worlds together. Not every consequence of Alexander's conquests was intended. Alongside trade, culture, and knowledge came instability, resentment, and loss of identity. The Hellenistic world was as fragile as it was vibrant. Ethnic tensions simmered beneath the surface. Greeks settled in new cities, often enjoyed privileges denied to locals. They controlled councils, commanded garrisons, and monopolized trade. Indigenous populations paid taxes, supplied labor, and watched foreigners occupy positions once held by their own elites. Resentment sparked revolts from rural uprisings in Asia Minor to resistance in Bactria and Egypt. Each revolt was crushed, but bitterness lingered. In Persia, blending cultures cut both ways. Some Persians embraced Greek language and fashion, while others saw it as erosion of ancestral traditions. Greek art adorned temples once sacred to Ahura Mazda. Greek coins carried Persian symbols, yet always beneath Greek kings. For many, fusion felt like domination, disguised as harmony. Even in Greece itself, the consequences were sharp. The brightest and bravest young men had marched east, leaving behind weakened communities. Villages in Macedonia and Thessaly lost generations to endless campaigns. Farms went untended, families grew poorer, and resentment spread at home. Athens, once cradle of democracy, became dependent on Hellenistic monarchs for protection. The freedom Alexander claimed to bring abroad eroded in the land that birthed him. Cultural blending created brilliance, but also anxiety. In Alexandria, temples honored Zeus Ammon, a hybrid deity. To some, it symbolized unity. To others, it represented loss, neither fully Greek nor fully Egyptian, but something in between. Children born of mixed marriages grew up speaking two languages, yet sometimes belonged fully to neither world. Identity blurred, sparking pride in cosmopolitanism for some, and alienation for others. Unintended consequences appeared in war as well. Alexander's innovations, large armies, siege engines, cavalry tactics, were adopted by successors. Their rivalries unleashed decades of conflict across the former empire. Ordinary people promised stability, instead lived under constant threat of shifting borders and new rulers. Fields that once fed soldiers of Persia now burned to supply armies of rival kings. Perhaps the deepest unintended legacy was expectation. Alexander had set a standard of ambition almost impossible to match. His successors sought to equal his scale, yet none could hold the empire together. Instead, their wars drained treasuries and lives, weakening the very states they sought to strengthen. The Hellenistic kingdoms flourished culturally, but decayed politically, their instability paving the way for Rome in the west and Parthia in the east. The paradox is clear. Alexander's dream of unity created both opportunity and fracture. Trade connected seas, but resentment divided peoples. Knowledge spread across libraries, but villages fell silent as young men marched away. Cultures fused in art, but identities eroded in daily life. The empire that promised harmony left behind both wonder and wounds. So who truly benefited? Merchants, scholars, and kings who thrived in cosmopolitan cities? Or peasants and villagers who bore heavier taxes, lost sons to wars, and saw traditions fade? The Hellenistic world was not a single story, but many, where winners and losers lived side by side. Responsibility for the world Alexander left behind is a chain that stretches across time. At its beginning stands the young king of Macedonia, brilliant and restless, driven by visions of conquest. His intentions, as far as we can know them, were shaped by ambition, revenge against Persia, and belief in divine destiny. Yet the results were far greater and far more complicated than any plan he could have written. Alexander's choices created immediate consequences. The burning of Persepolis scarred Persian memory. The destruction of Thebes warned Greece that rebellion meant annihilation. Massacres at Tyre and Gaza carved fear into local populations. These were deliberate acts, choices made in the heat of ambition. Responsibility for them rests squarely on Alexander. But long-term effects belonged also to his successors. After his death, generals turned allies into enemies. They executed Roxana and young Alexander IV, extinguishing his line. They divided the empire into fragments, waging decades of war that killed more civilians than Alexander's campaigns ever had. Their decisions deepened inequality, hardened divisions, and transformed a fleeting empire into a permanent state of conflict. Responsibility extended beyond Alexander to those who inherited his dream, but twisted it for their own survival. The collective legacy is paradoxical. Culturally, the Hellenistic world blossomed. Science advanced, art flourished, trade connected continents. Yet, politically, the empire collapsed into instability. Soldiers once united under one king now fought under many. Farmers who had hoped for peace after conquest instead faced endless levies. Alexander intended to rule the world. His successors intended only to rule their slice of it. Was this outcome inevitable? Could any man have held such vast lands together? Perhaps not. The empire was too large, too diverse, too fragile to survive without the personal magnetism of its founder. Institutions strong enough to endure were never built. Alexander fought as if his presence alone were glue, and when he was gone, the empire crumbled. Responsibility lies partly with his genius, which achieved too much too quickly, and partly with his failure to plan for succession. Modern reflection sharpens the contrast. Some see Alexander as pioneer of globalization, connecting distant cultures. Others see him as conqueror who unleashed violence for personal glory. Both are true. Responsibility cannot erase either side. His ambition gave the world Alexandria's library and new trade routes, but also fields soaked in blood and families sold into slavery. In this chain of accountability, Alexander stands first, his generals second, and the system of empire itself third. All shaped outcomes that neither maps nor monuments can disguise. History forces us to ask, does greatness excuse the damage it causes, or does damage outweigh the brilliance that creates it? Alexander's life offers no easy answer. It reveals only the complexity of human ambition and the cost of pursuing destiny without limit. The story of Alexander the Great ends not with a kingdom secured, but with questions still echoing across centuries. He was born in a small, rugged land at the edge of Greece, yet within 12 years carved an empire that stretched from the Mediterranean to the Indus. His campaigns toppled the Persian Empire, transformed the known world, and spread Greek culture across continents. But the roots of his achievement lay not only in genius, but in restless ambition, a hunger that knew no limits. Alexander revealed the power of vision. He united armies of diverse peoples, marched them through deserts, mountains, and rivers, and never lost a battle. His use of phalanx, cavalry, and daring maneuvers rewrote the art of war. His founding of cities created hubs where cultures blended, languages mixed, and ideas thrived. The Hellenistic world, with its science, art, and trade, was his truest legacy. Through it, knowledge crossed borders, and humanity glimpsed itself as part of a larger whole. Yet the same story warns of the cost of conquest. Alexander's greatness was built on fire and blood. Cities like Persepolis and Tyre fell in flames, thousands were enslaved, and families across Asia wept for lives lost. For every monument raised, another was destroyed. For every new opportunity, someone else paid with suffering. His ambition carried soldiers farther than they wished, until exhaustion broke their loyalty at the hyphasis. The king who claimed to unite the world also fractured it, leaving scars in Persia, India, and even Greece itself. His death at 32 froze him in time, eternally young, eternally brilliant. But the empire collapsed, almost at once, divided by his generals, fought over by rivals, and fractured into kingdoms. Without him, the unity he created evaporated. This reveals a deeper truth: greatness built on one man cannot endure. Institutions outlast individuals, but Alexander built few. He lived for conquest, not for stability. What then is his lesson? Some see him as a hero of globalization, bridging East and West. Others see him as tyrant, responsible for cruelty and destruction. The truth lies in the paradox. He was both builder and breaker, dreamer and destroyer. His life teaches that ambition can reshape the world, but unchecked it also devours it. Today, when nations debate power expansion and cultural exchange, Alexander remains relevant. His story warns that victory without justice breeds resentment, and unity without fairness fractures quickly. It also shows that courage, vision, and determination can change history in a single lifetime. The question is not whether Alexander was great, but what kind of greatness the world should admire. So imagine him in Babylon, fevered and dying his generals, waiting his empire trembling. He had conquered more than anyone before him, yet held it only briefly. He left no heir, only questions. Did he die believing he was a god? Did he fear he was only a man? And for us, the final question lingers: is greatness measured by what one conquers, or by what endures after one is gone?